Greetings and welcome everyone to the Global Council for Science and the Environment's webinar Beyond COP27, Sustaining Momentum on Climate Action. This event will be the first in a series of webinars designed to evaluate what happened at the 27th Annual Conference of Parties, also known as COP27 or the UN Climate Summit, held this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and discuss how our global community of researchers, thought leaders, educators, and decision makers can carry forward the energy and the solutions that were presented at that momentous event. Thank you all so much for attending. We're really excited to have you here today. My name is Alex Ramey. I represent GCSE. Before we get started, I want to do just some brief housekeeping. This webinar will last 60 minutes. Our agenda will include some brief introductions of GCSE and our role at COP27, an introduction of our incredible moderator and speakers, a 30-minute panel discussion, and 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A, time allowing, followed by our closing remarks at the end of the hour. Please note that this webinar is going to be recorded or is being recorded. Now, for those of you who are new to our organization, the Global Council for Science and the Environment, again, GCSE, is a non-governmental organization established in 1990 that advances the use of science to inform environmental decision-making. We open this webinar, as we do all GCSE events, by reading the GCSE oath to be anti-racist and inclusive through sustained learning, action, and accountability. GCSE acknowledges that regardless of one's own race or ethnicity, individuals are at various points along an anti-racist journey. As an organization committed to becoming anti-racist and multicultural, GCSE will purposefully work to identify, discuss, and challenge issues of race, color, ethnicity, orientation, and the impacts they have on GCSE, its mission, its partner organizations, and its people. We accept this challenge as our continuous journey. We explicitly and publicly affirm our identity as an anti-racist multicultural organization. We resolve to develop and work to implement strategies that dismantle racism within all aspects of our organization and society. We commit to recognize, address, and oppose all forms of racism, injustice, oppression, intolerance, and hate. As a global organization that advances the use of science to inform environmental decision-making and that brings together a range of stakeholders, including scientists and educators, business leaders, and public officials, GCSE has held observer status under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 2021. We have sent delegations to COP26 in Glasgow last year and to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt this past November. During today's webinar, the first in a series, again, you will hear from 4 individuals who attended COP27, each with a distinct area of expertise and a different level of experience with UN processes. I want to introduce the first of those individuals, our esteemed moderator, Diane Husic. Diane is the GCSE Senior Fellow for United Nations Climate and Sustainable Development Goals. She's also the founding dean and of the Center for Scholarship, Research, and Creative Endeavors, Director of Environmental Sciences and Studies Programs, and Professor of Biology at Moravian University. Diane has attended the UNFCCC COPs since 2009 and serves as a member of the Research and Independent NGOs, or RINGO's, Steering Committee and the Innovation Task Force for the Technology Executive Committee, or TEC. We are so grateful to have Diane with us here today. I will now pass the mic over to Diane to give us an overview of COP27, what this event is, and then introduce our panelists and get into our discussion. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Alex, and good afternoon to all of you in the audience. Before we get started with the panel discussion, I thought it might be good to give a little bit of background so that we're all kind of on the same level of understanding of this, this really complex organization and process. So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, is really a convention or an international agreement, and it's one of 3 that came out of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. The impetus for convening this summit was in large part due to the release of the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, in 1990. This report reviewed the state of the published literature on climate change at that time and discussed the global consequences of climate change. The authors noted that the complexity of the issue and the far-reaching consequences would require international cooperation to address the problem. Through the UNFCCC, member states, which are the countries that have signed on to the convention, agreed in that first convention to, quote, act in the interests of human safety, even in the face of scientific uncertainty. Since 1992, the scientific uncertainty about climate change has decreased significantly. There has been extensive subsequent research done around the world, and published data are reviewed and analyzed by IPCC members to determine degrees of certainty and consensus within the climate data and to identify gaps in the information. Their periodic reports are published, the most recent being the 6th assessment report, which was published in various pieces between 2021 and 2022, and a synthesis report that's due out basically at any time. The IPCC also publishes special reports at the request of the parties, such as the one on oceans and the cryosphere, which got a lot of attention at this year's COP27, and a report on methodologies or guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. Other entities put out reports such as the World Health Organization on the impact of climate change on human health. The UNFCCC was enacted or went into effect in 1994, and a year later in 1995, COP1, or the first Conference of the Parties, was held. This is a negotiation sessions for all of the signatories of the convention. COP27 then was the 27th meeting of the countries that signed the UNFCCC. Each of these annual COPs are aimed at working towards addressing causes of climate change and finding ways that countries can mitigate those problems, largely by reducing the level of emissions of what are known as greenhouse gases. Increasingly, the negotiations have also been about adaptation. How do we live in a world with growing consequences of the impact of a changing climate? How do we reduce the risk to human lives? How do we address both mitigation and adaptation in a manner that allows less developed countries to continue to develop? And so the negotiations are often integrated with the Sustainable Development Goals. The COPs are rotated among different global regions, and any agreement that comes out of a particular COP typically has a location name in it. So the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow Climate Pact, etc. The Paris Agreement of 2015 is the most significant outcome under the convention, and it has details about how do we address climate change. It went into effect in 2020, which is the one year we didn't have a COP, and that was due to COVID. To date, 194 parties have signed the Paris Agreement. Most COPs since Paris have been aimed at how to hammer out implementation deals of that agreement, and in particular, how to get countries to be more ambitious in their emission reduction goals, stated in their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. There's quite an alphabet soup of acronyms that are used in the UN, but also how to finance the needed technology, just energy transitions, and to address damages and loss experienced by countries around the world. So who are the players? You have the parties. These are official negotiators from each country that has signed the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement. The makeup of these delegations varies dramatically by country. Observers represent what is known as civil society. And this is the aggregate of non-governmental organizations and institutions that involve diverse cultural, religious, and special interest groups that represent and implement the interests, hopefully, of the will of the citizens. These could be environmentalists. There's the Women's Major Group. There are trade organizations and unions, business and industry, indigenous peoples organizations, researchers and scientists, and so on. Of course, each constituency has a different area of focus and views climate change and potential solutions through quite different lenses. There's the press, and then there's always high-level dignitaries, which includes heads of state. And from the US this year, President Biden, House Speaker Pelosi, cabinet members, senators, and so on showed up largely to convince the world that the US is still in the game, to make announcements about humanitarian aid, technology transfer, and funding initiatives. There's also UN officials such as the UN Secretary General and representatives from other branches of the UN, such as UNESCO, UNEP, and so on. COP27 was viewed as the implementation COP. And so with that background, I want to introduce our panelists, and I'm excited that we have such a breadth and diversity of experiences and expertise with us, who will share some of their insights from COP27. So the bios were distributed with the webinar announcement, so I'm only going to touch on a few highlights for each. Dr. Karim Ahmed is a co-founder of GCSE, and he's the Secretary Treasurer on the current Board of Directors. He's an adjunct professor on occupational and environmental medicine at the University of Connecticut Health Center. In his longstanding career as scientist in research in environmental health, Karim has served and advised national and international government agencies and scientific institutions, including the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the National Science Foundation, the United Nations Environmental Program, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. He has also worked with the World Resources Institute and the National Resources Defense Council. This was his first year to attend a COP, but he's been involved in many other UN processes. Dr. Esther Obono is Associate Professor of Engineering Design and Architectural Engineering at Pennsylvania State University. She is also Director of the Global Building Network, that is a partnership between the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and Penn State. Esther is a researcher with experience spanning sustainable design, international development, and climate resilience in the built environment. She has attended the UNEA meetings, which are the environmental group. The COP27 was her second. She has extensive industry experience in engineering and construction companies in Kenya, the United Kingdom, and the US. And our third panelist is Mohammed Abdullah. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan and a Fulbright Fellow mechanical engineer from Pakistan. His research experiences in transportation, biofuels, climate, and sustainability. At this year's COP, his second, Abdullah focused his attention on intergenerational participation in climate negotiations. So thank you to our panelists. To begin our conversation, I wanted to ask each of you to briefly describe one or two of your personal takeaways from COP27 from the perspective as a scientist and a GCS delegate. So Abdullah, would you like to kick this off? If not, maybe I'll have Esther, I'll have you start.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, we can.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction, Diane. I'm glad to be attending, to be one of the delegation of GCSE at COP27. And thank you for having me over here. Would be
So Esther, maybe we can begin with you while Abdullah works on his technology.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alex, and the entire team from the Global Council for Science and Environment, and also Diane for having us here. One of the biggest things for me going into COP, right from the registration process to my final day at COP, was the amazing opportunities we had for informal dialogues. A lot of the conversations that I had outside of attending several sessions, a lot of the conversations that I had were happening inside the commuter bus that was made available. I had a 40 to 50-minute commute, sometimes longer, depending on the number of people who are trying to get in. And I think, because we are brought into this public shared space, it was very easy for conversations to emerge, conversations with people who are not part of my business as usual, people who have not had a chance to meet, except for we are at COP. The final piece of what I'm going to share is, having gone to COP26 in Glasgow and comparing it with COP27, it was also very gratifying to see the number of African countries that had pavilions. In addition to the African Union, you had several African countries, Tanzania, Ghana, etc., setting up pavilions for engaging with different professional scientists and governments. That was very rewarding.
Karim? You're on mute.
Yes, this was my first COP meeting, and I've been to other UN conferences, Diane mentioned earlier. Well, I must say this is quite unique in terms of my previous experience of going to a conference of this nature. It was many of the earlier meetings I've been to, NGOs were not well represented, I must say. Industry and business were represented, all the UN agencies were there, many of the government representatives, but this was quite a breadth of people out there, scientists, non-scientists, policymakers, people from all walks of life. And Esther pointed out there's a lot of people from Africa, from Asia, parts of the world that you don't usually get to see when the meetings are held in European or North American venues. So in that sense, it was quite unique. And I must say that one of the things that came out of this meeting was, well, there was a lot of chaos because there were so many pavilions, you did not know where to go, what to do. But on the other hand, things went along quite well. beautiful setting. It was a resort town. But unlike Esther, I did not take the bus every day. And so I feel I missed out quite a bit by not sitting there and meeting all kinds of strangers, people I'd never met before. I was indulging myself with cabs instead. So I'm afraid to say I did not get the kind of experience that some of you got. So that's my initial remarks.
Okay. Abdullah, are you able to join us now?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll just be quick. In terms of personal takeaways, I got out of COP27, I would say, with a sense of a bit satisfaction, particularly when I am comparing it with COP26 experience. The reason for that is, I would say, I'm a Pakistani citizen, and because of the recent situation in Pakistan and my family having the historical connection of being one of the affectees of flood, it gave me some hope. So that was my positive aspect of it. But also I would say a slight concern that I noticed a bit of hesitation, as I've always been following COP for the past few COPs. It's always there. And unfortunately, I would say that I saw that in this COP experience as well. That's my 2 cents about my personal experiences.
Okay. And Abdullah, would you kind of elaborate on that hesitation piece?
Yes, just if we notice for being just brief, the fact that the talks continued till 11:30 p.m. till the last date. And there were like so many nitty-gritties on which the negotiations had to happen again and again just to add or remove or edit particularly words. One example from the past or this COP would be like fossil fuels versus coal. Every word is, most of the countries or even scientists particularly are pushing for removing all fossil fuels, but there was only focus on coal, for example. So just kind of like these small details, being a researcher, maybe I'm being too picky. But yes, again, I personally had some reservation or noticed these reservation, I would say.
Great, thanks.
If that answered your question. Thank you.
So the second question I want to ask the panelists is, can you speak to the importance of the interaction between scientists and policymakers that attend the COPs? And Karim, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay. It's in my case in particular, I had worked with some of the delegates ahead of time. So by the time I arrived at COP, and I also prepared my a major report on loss and damage, and that was circulated to some of the policymakers and to NGOs. The way I saw the whole thing is that it's very hard during the actual negotiations, Abdullah mentioned, for NGOs who are not part of any government representative to be able to participate. But there are ample opportunities outside that for people like myself and other scientists to interact with policymakers. And quite a bit of information can be passed along. And in our case, in my particular case, I worked on loss and damage in particular. And many of the issues that we had raised before the conference and during the conference ultimately got into the final document, and which is very, very gratifying. It's very seldom that you have that opportunity to do something that really carries over. And hopefully it'll carry over to the next COP meeting that's going to happen next year. So in a sense, that having that kind of intimate relationship established before and during the meeting plays a we can play a very major role in influencing the outcome of the conference. So that's a short way of looking at how interactions can be very helpful.
Yeah, Abdullah, do you want to comment on that about interactions between scientists and policymakers?
I have a background in mechanical engineer. I'm doing a PhD, as everyone knows, in mechanical engineering. But I noticed the importance of policy making only started to notice importance of policy about a few years ago. And that's when I entered in the field of science, environment, and sustainability from the policy perspective. Because I've noticed researchers, scientists can play their role as much as they can, but they cannot enforce it it has to be the governments, the people in charge, unfortunately, who are not scientists most of the times. So there is definitely a dire need between scientists, the researchers, and policymakers. They need to inform policymakers and government officials, again, because eventually that's who with whom the power lies. If that speaks and answers the question.
And Esther, I know you had some interesting conversations with policymakers. Do you want to share a little bit of that?
Yeah, so I participated in COP first as a bus rider, which was awesome. So there was a lot of informal communication and conversations that were happening. But then I was also on a panel, and I was an observer, and I'll reflect on all three. Coming in as a university professor made it very easy for me to make a connection with several policymakers, both, during the sessions where we were on the panel and you're talking and you're saying, I'm a professor at Penn State, sitting next to an emergency room doctor who says, I'm also a researcher at Harvard University. The response that we were getting from the policymakers who were around us was very positive, because they were talking about lack of evidence. They want more research, for example, that can help them understand the benefits of greening more spaces in the urban setting. There's also these informal conversations that I talked about earlier, that as I was walking down the corridor, I shouted, Governor Sakaja, that's the governor of Nairobi, and he stopped. And I very quickly told him, I'm a professor at Penn State, and that got his attention. And I said the same thing to another governor from Homer Bay County. When I was introduced to her, then I immediately said, I'm a professor. And that got their attention. And to me, that means that there's a recognition that universities can generate public good. We are not selling anything. We are educating. We are generating the type of evidence that they need to make decisions. So I see us as being pivotal if we situate ourselves as educators and generators of public good.
Esther, could I just say something quickly, since you're from Kenya?
Yes.
One of my students, I also teach at University of Cape Town, and so I've been teaching long distance. And one of my students from Kenya knew that I was there, so he writes me, texts me, and asks me if he could come to my pavilion and meet with me. So I had a chance to meet my student in person at the COP meeting. So I just want to mention that to you.
That's great.
Yeah, I think those kinds of international connections, whether they're with policymakers or whether with students or with colleagues that are in similar areas of research, are a really important part of the interactions. There was also a side event, which is basically a panel discussion. There's several of these throughout the 2 weeks. And it was a conversation between early career individuals or students, most of them graduate students in engineering, Abdullah, and people from the delegations or the parties. And the conversation was, how do we get the younger generation to have more of a say with the people who are making the decisions that will affect their future? And so it was a really interesting conversation. And one of the things, Karim, you just mentioned South Africa, they noted that their population has over 50% of people under 35. And so they have in their constitution now a new rule that the representation in their parliament has to reflect that distribution in their demographics. And so they're working on capacity building of the youth. And so I think that's a really interesting development. And one of the ministers from Canada was speaking of the same thing, the need. They had 30 young people with their parties, with their sort of what they call the overflow badges, shadowing their actual negotiators to start grooming them for the process so they're ready to take over someday. So another question I want to ask the panel: how does the decision-making process at this global level benefit from the presence of researchers at the COPs, especially as we think about some of the key issues that the negotiators were grappling with, such as that emissions gap in which the country pledges to reduce greenhouse gases are really insufficient at this point to limit planetary warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels? Or how do we figure out as researchers, that questions of finance, how to transition to clean energy and support sustainable development and resilience in the global south? So Karim, do you want to start with that one?
Yes. Well, the way I look at it is, and you mentioned this in passing, Diane, that the early COP meetings really emphasized more on mitigation, or played more in. And now more increasingly, we're talking about adaptation because we're learning more about the impacts of climate change. So the way I look at it is twofold. One is that the developed countries should just continue to emphasize mitigation. There's no doubt about it, because they are most responsible for climate change right now. However, there should be a greater degree of emphasis on adaptation on the part of developing countries, both in terms of adaptation and building resilience. Up to now, and particularly in the field of financing, much of the money has been distributed kind of evenly. And so the developing countries, when they go to, say, the Global Green Fund, they have a distinct disadvantage because most of the money should be going towards adaptation, which they can't get hold of because the way it is structured. So in the global negotiation, I think there is going to have to be a major, you might say, rearranging of how funding is done in terms of mitigation and adaptation. This is a very critical issue. And more countries, and Abdullah mentioned about what happened in Pakistan. This is a very crucial issue for many countries who are very seriously impacted.
And can researchers play a role in helping to make that shift?
Well, researchers can do in terms of identifying how this kind of financing system can work. We have to work much more with scientists and economists to figure this out. And one of the major issues coming up next year's COP meeting is going to be about exactly this question. We have set up the framework. Now we have to actually get the financing done. How do you do that? Who's responsible? Who's, and all kinds of creative ways to bring in the funds that are not being done right now.
So Abdullah, from your perspective as an early career researcher in training, if you will, what role or what is the benefit of having researchers at the COPs? You might be muted.
Sorry. The benefit, I would reiterate my previous comment and also add on to Karim's comment, is to inform and make spread awareness about the importance of the science, the facts, basically. Because what I see as a person in general outside COP, and even in the COP, when I was visiting other places within Egypt, there was this sense of skepticism. Having researchers, scientists is critical because they have all of the data, scientifically proven data, which is backing their recommendations, their suggestions, not just for a few months, few weeks, but the whole climate data, which spreads over the decades. They know the learnings from the history. They can project based on the history, multiple scenarios about the futures, and then based on that can suggest or make recommendations, which are again factual based and factually proven. It is, I would say, there's no reason to have any COP without the presence of researchers or scientists. In simple words, does that answer your question?
Sure. And one really good example that I saw this year is there's a pavilion about the cryosphere. And the new state of the cryosphere had just come out, and I saw those researchers basically going around and explaining to negotiators or the parties what the significance of that report and how fast change is happening. And for the first time ever in the cover decision, cryosphere is mentioned. But I think there was a lack of understanding about how serious of an issue that was. Esther, what do you think the benefit of having researchers is at the COPs?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the events that I attended was about women and finance, and it was a panel that had very high-level officials, and it also had this one lady at the grassroots level. And when it was her turn to speak, her first comment got her standing ovation because she talked about things at the local level. Yeah, and she was challenging what the other people had said. And this was repeated in several other pavilions where we had grassroots-led movement being represented. And they wanted to know, How are we defining impact? Because the high-level goals, the high-level ambitions need to be translated to impact at the grassroots level. We need to have metric of success that is relatable at the grassroots level, at the local level. And I see the university researchers playing a pivotal role here, because we can understand, we can straddle both skills. We can talk with the high-level officials, but we are also very local. We build networks. Organizations such as the Global Council for Science and Environment give us platforms, or even the initiative that I'm leading, the Global Building Network. We have ways of making these network-to-network connections that allow the people who are asking at the grassroots level measure impact and define success at the very local level. We can give them objective metrics for doing this.
That's
Could I
fantastic.
just add to what
Yeah.
Esther just said, Diane? I think I sat in a panel on open science, which was organized by the American Geophysical Union. And I raised the issue about open knowledge and not just science. And I think what Esther pointed out is very important, that scientists can act as a bridge between policymakers and people working at the grassroots level and the local level. And because we have to work with many of them, particularly those of us who do field research, coming across a lot of people who work, who are in the villages and out there in the, in the environment that most policymakers are far distant from. So I think in that sense, if you define open knowledge in the context of open science, a lot of information can be passed on. And this should be, more encouraged in the future.
That's great. And we're going to come back to the idea of what we bring back locally in one second. But I just wanted to point out that we focus on the COPs, these big events that get a lot of media attention and bring everybody together at a location around the world. But there's a lot of work within the UNFCCC process or within the Paris Agreement that happens around the year. And in the introductory comments, Alex mentioned that I serve on a task force for the technology executive mechanism. And that's another place where scientists play a big role, as looking at where are the best new innovations coming from, but also a lot of South-South cooperation. What are innovations in sort of that open knowledge idea that you just mentioned, Karim, that farmers are having on the ground and finding ways to address changing rainfall or changing weather conditions of other sorts, that they've learned to adapt their growing practices? How can we share that information across platforms in other countries where it might work as well? So we focus on this 2-week event, but there's a lot of work that happens within the full year. So the last question I want to bring to the panelists before we open it up for questions. Each of you have attended at least one COP now. And what do you bring back to campus or the larger community in which you live and work? Or in other words, how do we take this huge agenda from an international level and show how it's relevant at the local level? How do we take this complex jargon or these really complex IPCC reports and make it relevant for your hometown? Those kinds of questions. What do you bring back? And Esther, I'll start with you on that one.
Right, thank you. So I think, first of all, having this discussion similar to the webinar which we are hosting today, this is very useful because we are hoping that it will trigger some additional dialogues with our colleagues and anybody who's going to be watching this recording. But I think also one of the things I hadn't highlighted was my role as an educator. When I sat in a panel that featured young men and women from the Brazilian context, they used phrases such as education empowers them to occupy spaces where these decisions are being made. So I'm coming back excited as a researcher, excited as a network builder, but even more excited about the potential that university-based professionals can play in terms of capacity building, education, training, workforce development, things which the disadvantaged communities, whether it's people of color, women from and men from the small island nations, they're asking for these things. They're asking for education, capacity building, because they see it as a way of empowering themselves to occupy the spaces where the decisions are being made.
Great. Abdullah, what did you bring back?
Thank you for this question, and thanks to Esther. I was going to raise the same voice. That GCSE, this webinar is particularly a great example. My personal comment I was going to say to everyone in my community and everyone attending the webinar, don't be shy in raising your voice. I have seen over the multiple years in my academic in my personality of academician, and also researcher and attending COPs, raising your voice will definitely help eventually. Initially, it feels like you're only one person, but at these global platforms, when you start, when you trigger something, people join you. And it's that power of speaking that gave children and youth their whole first pavilion at COP27. And I was so excited. Technically, I'm still under the 32, so fall under the definition of young. And I felt really happy and excited that finally these younger generation who are actually at the stakes, because any decision that you are going to make, the policymaker, will gonna affect younger generation and their next generation. So they have been raising their voice. They still are raising their voice, and that's my key takeaway. And also learning or comment request to everyone: raise your voices, continue the struggle. Thank you.
As you noticed, this was the first COP where the youth had their own pavilion. And it's so nice we were talking in our planning discussions about the increased number of scientists that are early career, the students who come to the Ringo's meetings and are really interested in getting involved with, creating solutions. There's the activists, but then there's people who just gather to share with each other in terms of what are you doing in your country or your hometown and so on. So Karim, what did you bring back, or what do you bring back from the COP to your local university or community?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think because I'm based in the United States these days, and the United States considers itself to be self-sufficient little island, and they don't know what goes on in the rest of the world. It's good to remind my colleagues here back in the United States that we do live in a larger complex, a global complex of, and by being at COP, myself, for example, I remind myself how we are connected. I mean, I think about things very nowadays abstractly, or use a lot of, I even teach on Zoom and so on. But it's very important for us to bring back that understanding, because I think many Americans today only think that everything begins here and ends here. The last administration just walked out of the Paris Treaty. They didn't even care. And now we are back on it. That is the kind of thing we have in this country. And even though I'm originally, like Mohammed, from Pakistan myself, and I have connections there and I'm in touch with people there, it's not the same thing. I mean, Abdullah probably will be going back as a mechanical engineer, but I've been here for well over 50 years. So I feel like I'm more American than I'm Pakistani at the moment. But nevertheless, this is a very important thing, is to give people an understanding that there is a bigger world out there.
I think that's very important. And I think you mentioned when the US pulled out, having been to several COPs during that period, the lack of trust or the broken trust between the US and the rest of the world was something that if you're at the COPs, you realize, but if you're sitting back at home, you don't necessarily gather that. And Alex, I know you're going to take over and moderate the questions, but I see that there's one that came up on a comment that Esther made. And I don't remember what comment that was, but basically the question is, do you feel that the scientific community is still working in silos without any involvement of local communities or government, and not expanding their research to application? And I know we talked a lot in our discussions planning for this about how do you take the science and turn it into action, in not just this theoretical framework. So Esther, I think that was partially directed to you, but I think anyone.
Yeah, so I think the answer is yes and no. So I say yes, the reward structures within our university, they have not evolved. And there's discussions going on about how to evolve and embrace work that is more impact focused. I don't think there is any university administrator or leader anywhere in the world who will have any objection to that. So I think it's a process, and a lot of universities are making significant investments to try to address this issue through helping stand up initiatives that are cross-cutting. All the universities that are affiliated with the Global Council for Science and Environment for sure are moving in this direction. So I give an example: Penn State, for a year and a half, there's been investment made in standing up an initiative that's called Climate Health and the Built Environment. And that brings in so many people from very many different disciplines. The partnerships that exist with the Global Council for Science and Environment, again, have been instrumental in helping us try to understand how to translate some of these things into policy making at the subnational level, for me, in my case, in Tanzania, and that's still a work in progress. So I say, yes, we are still kind of stuck in our old models, but we are moving. The COVID pandemic was a big jolt, like lightning jolt on all of us, and it has had some positive outcomes. I think there's hope. And then also in the defense of the universities, because I'm a university professor, maybe I'll say, who's not working in a silo? The government people are working in a silo. Community members also will say the same thing. So I think it is our weakness as human beings. We default to a comfort zone. And we always need something external to shock us a little bit for us to step outside our comfort zone. And that is the only way we are going to address the silos, by being willing to be pushed out of our comfort zones, whether we're in a university, a public agency, or even a community sector organization. So work in progress.
Yeah. And I think GCSE has been really good over the years in bringing these different constituency groups together, whether it's agencies at the federal or state level, cities, mayors, and so on together. A lot of campus faculty and students are involved with their local community in developing climate action plans, sitting on environmental justice councils. So I think you're right, Esther, it's shifting, but there's still a lot to do. So Alex, you want to take over with some questions?
Yes, absolutely. And I did just want to note for the audience here that many people who registered for the event had submitted some questions with their registration. So we're going to bounce between the live Q&A, and thank you to those who have already submitted questions and to those who submitted questions ahead of time. So I do want to move on to Frank's question here, and I'll just read it here for Frank. It says, the media naturally focus on conflict and controversy. COP27 got a lot of coverage revolving around those themes, from issues around the host, Egypt, to the adequacy of the loss and damage initiative, which you all have brought up earlier in the webinar. What do you think the correct narrative should be for COP27 and the current state of global efforts to combat climate change? This is a big question. I mean, you all on the ground all had such diverse experiences, so I think it would be maybe helpful to get a summary narrative, maybe also from you, Diane. So maybe I'll pass it over to you first, and we'll see what other panelists want to contribute.
Yeah, I think Frank's observations, it's hard to watch the press coverage when you're there because you're kind of in the middle of the actual events, but everything from the jacking up prices to the concern about an activist, a British activist that was imprisoned, and whether he was on a hunger strike, those narratives became kind of overshadowing at some point. What do I think the correct narrative is? Well, for somebody who's been going to the COPs for a really long time, the breakthrough in loss and damage, even getting, basically, one thing I forgot to mention in my introductory comments, any agreement, any document that comes out of a COP has to be 100% consensus. And to get that 194 countries to agree on loss and damage fund is really quite an amazing feat. Now, the devil will be in the details, and how do we fund that? How do we implement it? But I think the fact that we were able to cross that hurdle is one of the biggest stories out of COP27.
Yeah, I agree with that completely, that getting the loss and damage on the agenda, not only the agenda, but actually doing something about it and setting up an international framework was what we were pushing for before the conference, and having it achieved there. I was very skeptical about this happening at all. When I met with some of the representatives during the meeting, they also expressed a great deal of skepticism about this happening. But in the last moment, it did happen because there was a lot of work behind the scenes, lots of pressure. And finally, the United States gave way. I would blame the United States for being very intransigent on these issues for numbers and numbers of years. And I think finally, and who knows what happened to make them change their mind, but that was a great achievement at this COP meeting.
Right. Abdullah?
I would say it's totally, okay, maybe not fair, but it's totally understandable what the comment says about the media. Considering it's such a huge platform with 30 to 40,000, even 50,000 members, 200 countries, hundreds of NGOs. Good thing, again, there are so many voices. So it might be a bit difficult situation to take everything neutrally. And I would agree that you should not take it neutrally, because sometimes neutral way can hurt some countries. But agreeing to your comments, it's still a success and achievement to have 194 countries on agreeing on this fund. There are really good things coming out of the COP, and these webinars, and I also saw a comment from Professor Richard. These outreach activities, sharing your personal experiences from COPs, can help alleviate those negative or controversial achievement by sharing what was the positive aspect that each of our member who attended the COP in person observed and noticed. So there is definitely some success, some hope, some good things on top of the controversial topics. And it's always going to be like that. Wherever there are more than one person, there is always going to be some differences, and we should all be respectful and mindful and understanding of those differences. That's my humble opinion about that. But yeah, we should not ignore the successes, the positivities that are coming out of these platforms.
Great. Alex, do you want to pick another question?
I wanted to say something, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Esther.
Yeah, so I wanted to actually bring in the perspective of the Global South into the equation. So one of the reasons why I do this is because I pledge allegiance to the US, but I'm also originally from Kenya and my husband is from Tanzania. So talking to people who are from those countries, I see the source of their frustration. There's been deals that have been previously made. I think the number that's being quoted is $100 billion that the developed countries have pledged. And as far as I know, very little, maybe even nothing has moved to some of those countries. So there's some real concern, like, this is not about emotions. This is about a fact that in the previous years, there were pledges made about climate adaptation financing, but money did not move. So I can see how, whereas we have a lot to celebrate and say, yes, we have this loss and damages clause, there's still also some concern that history could repeat itself. And it was acknowledged even at the very end that, there's still a lot of work to be done to detail out what does this really mean and who's going to pay and all that kind of thing. So there is an understanding that history, the history of things not being honored is resulting in the Global South saying, how is this going? Some of the people saying, how is this going to be different? On the positive side, I also wanted to say, similar to what Abdullah shared, there were a lot of events. There were a lot of events, and the media is only showing a small sample of the things that were going on there. The side events showcased amazing, amazing work that's being done at the grassroots level by ordinary men and women and young people. And that is a story that is not being told enough. Bye.
Wow, these are such profound comments. I found myself wanting to write down some of the things that you were saying as you were saying that, but I'll direct our next question sort of on that note of representation and who has a role, who participates. One of the questions submitted ahead of time was about who is taking part in our climate solution. So this included, how could youth and women and Indigenous voices contribute to alleviating climate change and being part of this decision-making process? You all have touched a little bit already on representation, but just wanted to see if we can dig a little deeper to answer this audience question.
Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I kind of missed it. Apologies. Could you please briefly summarize the comment, Diane or Alex?
I think it's the idea of the different representation, right, Alex? Like what?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there were a couple people ahead of time who were specifically asking about thinking globally about Indigenous communities as well as women. And if you see any intersections happening there in maybe research that includes these voices and where they show up at the climate negotiations, just based on your experience or your observations.
Well, I think one of the most famous places where you had a conflict, if you will, between Indigenous voices and the people who were making the rules was the idea of having a carbon mechanism where countries could continue to pollute as long as they offset their carbons by protecting rainforests somewhere. And nobody ever talked to the people who had managed those rainforests for hundreds or thousands of years. And so it was the REDD agreement, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And there were all of a sudden stipulations. So a country would come in and sort of put a lot of money to protect a particular forest, but then tell these people who lived there that they couldn't do certain things anymore. And the indigenous voice at the table, this is really what got them there, and had not only just being at the COPs, but having a voice at the table, was saying, wait a minute, this is not fair. This is a new form of colonialism. You need to think about the implications of what you're doing. And so I think those kinds of things were, while there's nothing inherently bad in carbon offsets necessarily, the idea of how we implement those, we need the people on the ground who are going to be impacted by those decisions to have a voice at the table. It's sort of one perspective.
All right, I can have a go next. So I think this is like in the public domain, like there's that picture of the, high-ranking officials who at the end of the day, have the final say on whether or not we're going to have an agreement. So I think the number was 3, that there were only 3 women. And yes, it was an improvement from 0, but it's just 3. So there's definitely something missing there. And we can also look at the settings in the pavilions, that if you are in the building pavilion, I'm from a built environment background, the building pavilion had support from the private sector. It was a really, really nice pavilion, spread out. Yeah, you could go there for free refreshments. So there was also that unfortunate dynamics happening there, that you see smaller countries, African countries, I will not name any of them, they have the small pavilion that, also shows the lack of resources. And I think that is kind of unfortunate, that we go to this event where you can literally move from one zone to another. And actually, even within the same zone, you see okay, here there's money, and here there's free drinks, here there's no money, and it's a global South country. So that's really, really unfortunate. Again, I want to end on a positive note with my comments, that it was also very nice to see that when you walk into these pavilions of the countries that have smaller, lower financial powers, they are optimistic. They are not coming there with a message of, we are needy, help us. They're actually showcasing some of the solutions that they've rolled out on the ground. I'm talking about the small island nations, Brazil, the young people from the Amazon forest. We had young people standing up, a 29-year-old lady saying she has set up a financing company because she wanted the decisions to happen internally within the community. I don't know how she pulled that off, but she did. She is now a distributor of money. She makes the decisions in consultation with the community. And last but not least, Karim, you may remember when we had the delegation from California hosted by the Global Council for Science and Environment, at the end of their presentation, sharing highlights of the California's historic climate action bill, there was a gentleman from Grenada, I believe his name was Johan, who stood up and he said, I'm from a small island nation, and my big idea is that I want to go on this journey around the world in 185 days, empowering young people by showcasing examples of solutions that are being led by people who have been historically marginalized. I think that is very, very encouraging.
I agree with that. And what was interesting, Esther, was that at that California panel that we had in our pavilion, the involvement of the whole senior level people from the California legislature was extraordinary. Not only what they have accomplished, but what they're willing to help the rest of the world with. So that was very encouraging, including the comment made by the gentleman from Grenada. I've been in touch with that gentleman, by the way. He is really going to launch that program. He's been sending me some background material, and he's quite serious about going around the world and carrying out his mission with young people.
I think the points that both of you just made, and that question that's on from Mamta Mehra about the the relevance of the COP and our leaders really understanding the urgency. Two kind of things that come to mind is, one, so much of the innovation, the ideas and the optimism that's coming is not happening at the negotiations table. It's happening by people in their communities and aren't getting the media attention, except sometimes at the pavilion, sometimes at the site events. But we need to tell more of those stories. And I get asked the question all the time about the relevance of a COP. From my perspective, having gone now for many, many years, while it's slow and frustrating, it keeps the attention on climate change as a global issue and gives signals to, I think, the markets, to the places like the World Bank, to governments, that you really need to be dealing with this as one of the biggest issues facing humanity. And the action, though, which may not be coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh or Glasgow or whatever, it's coming out in these innovations at the local level, whether it's cities or indigenous people or whatever. And I think we forget that. And I'm sure if we didn't have somebody pushing us and reminding us about the extent of this issue, these may not be happening.
So I think that we'll have to wrap up the Q&A there. Unfortunately, this is such a rich topic. I think, as you all probably experienced going to COP, there's so many things to absorb, and even in this webinar, we couldn't possibly cover all of it. I'm going to turn it over to Diane for maybe some last questions for the panelists, and then I will deliver our closing remarks.
Yeah. So I asked each panelist to give me in one sentence what their hope is coming out of COP27, what they're feeling, their message of hope to the audience. So Karim?
Yes, my hope would be in one sentence, now that the loss and damage framework has been set up, that what we hope to get is climate reparations decided, who's responsible, and also to take up the question of global security that will occur from environmental refugees affected by climate change.
Thanks. Abdullah?
Let's say defining, like, my hope is, I can see the success moving towards the success line, but it's running on the back of a turtle, whereas it should be sitting on a rabbit's back.
Okay, and Esther?
My final sentence is about collaboration. There was a genuine understanding across the board that implementation means getting out of our comfort zones, getting out of our silos, and forming these partnerships with people who we don't normally engage with, whether it's by discipline, by sector, country, region. That is where the innovation is going to happen, outside of our comfort zones, networking, collaborating.
Great. And for me, I think the piece that keeps resonating with me is my message of hope. The U.S. Center, which often showcases the science, the NASA, the NOAA information, they had the Department of Defense and USAID talking about climate action is the way to world peace. And to me, that was such a profound statement coming from the Department of Defense representative. And so that was a hopeful sign for me. So Alex, I'm going to turn this over to you for the final remarks.
Thank you so much. And in closing, I want to thank all of our amazing panelists, as well as you, our audience, for your participation. And we're especially thankful to our panelists for your insight as individuals who were on the ground at COP27 and can speak to the impacts of this event beyond the climate negotiations themselves, how it impacted you as individuals, how it impacts the research and university community. It's extremely valuable. Now, this webinar, as a reminder, is just a start to the conversation that we hope to grow and sustain in the coming months. So based on our audience questions today, based on the topics that we covered today and other feedback from our member community, we look forward to diving a little deeper into some more scientific and topical matters coming out of COP27. So with that, again, I just want to thank all of the audience. Please stay tuned for some follow-up communications from us, some emails asking you for more feedback, and an invitation to our 2023 continuation of the Beyond COP series. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, GCSE.
Thank you, Alex.